The wind howled like a wounded animal across the frozen tundra of northern Alaska. At -61 degrees Celsius, the cold didn't just bite, it devoured. Every breath felt like inhaling shards of glass. Every exposed inch of skin a countdown to frostbite. In this merciless landscape, where even the strongest men feared to venture during winter's darkest months, a solitary figure moved through the snow. Margaret Hayes was her name, though most folks in the nearby town of Coldfoot simply called her the Widow Woman. At 53 years old, her face bore the harsh lines of someone who had weathered more than just brutal Alaskan winters. 3 years ago, her husband Daniel had died in a snowmobile accident while checking their trap lines. The town had expected her to sell the remote homestead and move somewhere warmer, somewhere easier. Instead, she stayed. The homestead sat 12 miles from the nearest neighbor, a collection of weathered buildings that included a small cabin, a barn, and several sheds. It wasn't much, but it was hers. More importantly, it was where she and Daniel had built their life together, where their dreams had taken root in the permafrost. Leaving would mean abandoning more than just property. It would mean letting go of every memory, every shared moment, every whispered promise made under the northern lights. Margaret had learned to survive alone. She chopped her own wood, maintained the generator, and tended to her small flock of sheep, hardy Icelandic breeds that could withstand the extreme cold better than most. The sheep weren't just livestock. They were her companions, her purpose, her reason to wake up each morning when the darkness threatened to swallow her whole. On this particular February morning, the thermometer outside her kitchen window read -61 Celsius. Even for Alaska, this was extreme. Margaret stood at the stove, warming her hands around a mug of black coffee, watching the steam rise and immediately crystallize in the air near the window. She had already been outside once to break the ice in the water troughs and distribute hay to the sheep in the barn. That's when she noticed one was missing. Bella, her prize ewe, heavily pregnant and due to lamb within days, wasn't with the others. Margaret's heart had clenched. She recounted twice, 3 times. 17 sheep when there should be 18. Bella was gone. She pulled on her heaviest parka, the one Daniel had bought her from a trapper in Fairbanks. She wrapped her face in a wool scarf, pulled on 2 pairs of gloves, and stepped into her insulated boots. The cold hit her like a physical force, even through all those layers. This was the kind of cold that killed within minutes if you weren't careful, the kind that froze tears before they could fall. Margaret trudged toward the fence line, following the barely visible tracks in the windswept snow. Her headlamp cut through the pre-dawn darkness, creating eerie shadows that danced across the white landscape. The tracks led away from the barn, toward the tree line where the black spruce forest began. Her stomach tightened. Bella must have somehow gotten out during the night, probably spooked by something. Then she heard it, a sound that made her blood run colder than the air around her. Wolves. Not the distant howling she sometimes heard on quiet nights, but the excited yipping and snarling of a pack that had found prey. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew that sound. She had heard it before, years ago, when wolves had taken down a moose near their property. Margaret broke into a run, as much as anyone could run through knee-deep snow in -61 weather. Her lungs burned. Her legs screamed in protest, but she pushed forward. Bella was out there, pregnant and vulnerable, and every second mattered. As she crested a small rise, her headlamp illuminated a scene from a nightmare. In a small clearing ahead, Bella was backed against a fallen log, her eyes wide with terror. Surrounding her were 6 wolves, gaunt, desperate creatures with ribs showing through their winter coats. The pack had been having a hard winter too, and a pregnant sheep was an easy meal they couldn't pass up. The largest wolf, probably the alpha male, was already moving in for the kill. His teeth were bared, his body low and ready to lunge. Bella bleated desperately, a sound so filled with fear and helplessness that it pierced Margaret's heart like an arrow. Margaret didn't think. She didn't calculate the odds or consider her own safety. She simply reacted, screaming at the top of her lungs and charging forward into the clearing, waving her arms above her head to make herself appear larger. The wolves turned toward her, their eyes reflecting the light from her headlamp like dozens of tiny flames in the darkness. For a moment, Everything froze. The wolves stared at Margaret, calculating this new threat. She could see their breath rising in clouds of vapor, could hear the low growls rumbling from their throats. 6 against 1. In this cold, in this darkness, she knew the odds were catastrophically against her. The alpha wolf took a step toward her, then another. His lips curled back, revealing yellowed fangs that gleamed in the harsh light. Margaret's hand instinctively went to her belt, searching for the flare gun she always carried. Her fingers, already growing numb despite the gloves, fumbled with the holster. The cold was making her clumsy, slowing her reactions when she needed speed most. Behind the wolves, Bella collapsed into the snow, too exhausted and terrified to stand any longer. Margaret could see the sheep's sides heaving, could see the way her pregnant belly rose and fell with each labored breath. The ewe was going into labor, right here, right now, in the middle of a frozen hell with death circling around her. Margaret finally freed the flare gun and raised it with shaking hands. She fired into the air. The flare shot upward with a sharp crack, exploding into brilliant red light that turned the snow crimson. The wolves scattered momentarily, yelping and retreating several yards. But they didn't run. They were too hungry, too desperate. Within seconds, they began circling again, regrouping. She had one flare left, just one. The alpha wolf was no longer intimidated. He had seen the light, assessed it, and determined it wasn't a real threat. He began advancing again, this time with more confidence. The other wolves followed his lead, tightening the circle. Margaret could smell them now. The wild, musky scent of predators who hadn't eaten in days, maybe weeks. Her mind raced through options. The homestead was too far to run. Even if she could move quickly through the deep snow, the wolves would overtake her in seconds. Climbing a tree was impossible in this cold. Her hands were already losing feeling, and the nearest spruce with low enough branches was 20 yards away. Fighting was suicide. 6 wolves against a middle-aged woman with no weapon besides a single remaining flare. But she couldn't leave Bella. She couldn't watch this animal. This creature she had raised from a lamb, who had survived 3 brutal Alaskan winters, who was about to bring new life into the world, be torn apart. Daniel would never have abandoned one of their animals. He had died trying to save them, trying to be a good steward of the life they were responsible for. A wolf lunged at Bella. Margaret screamed and fired her last flare directly at the pack. The projectile struck the snow near the alpha, erupting in a shower of sparks and smoke. The wolves yelped and backed away again, but this time Margaret could see it in their eyes. They knew she was out of ammunition. They knew she was helpless. The alpha wolf turned his full attention to Margaret now. His yellow eyes locked on hers. He had made his decision. She was the real threat. She had to be eliminated first. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as the alpha wolf advanced, his massive paws crunching through the frozen crust of snow. She had nothing left, no flares, no weapons, no options. Her mind flashed to Daniel, to the life they had shared, to the promise she had made at his grave to keep their dream alive. Was this how it would end? Frozen and broken in the Alaskan wilderness? Then, from somewhere deep inside, a memory surfaced. Daniel teaching her about wolves, explaining their behavior during one of their long winter nights by the fire. Wolves rarely attack humans unless cornered or starving. They respect size and aggression. Show no fear. Never run. Make noise. Be bigger than you are. Margaret planted her feet firmly in the snow. Instead of retreating, she stepped forward. She spread her arms wide, making herself as large as possible, and released a primal scream that came from the depths of her soul. A sound of rage, of grief, of absolute refusal to surrender. It was the cry of a woman who had lost everything and would not lose one thing more. The sound echoed across the frozen landscape, raw and wild. She screamed again, and again, each cry louder than the last. She stomped her boots, shook her arms, and advanced toward the alpha wolf with a ferocity that surprised even herself. This was her land, her sheep, her life, and she would fight for it with everything she had left. The alpha wolf hesitated. His ears flattened against his skull. Margaret could see the confusion in his eyes. This prey was acting like a predator. She took another step forward, screaming until her throat felt raw. The wolf took a step back, then another. The rest of the pack began to shift nervously, looking to their leader for guidance. But the alpha was retreating, his confidence shaken by this small human who refused to be a victim. Margaret pressed her advantage, continuing to advance, continuing to scream, channeling every ounce of pain and determination into her voice. One by one, the wolves began to retreat toward the tree line. The alpha was the last to turn, casting one final look at Bella before disappearing into the darkness. Margaret didn't stop screaming until the last wolf vanished into the spruce forest, their forms swallowed by shadows and snow. Only then did she collapse to her knees, gasping for air, her body shaking uncontrollably from adrenaline and cold. She had done it. Somehow, impossibly, she had faced down a wolf pack in 61 degree below zero weather and survived. Behind her, Bella let out a weak bleat. Margaret turned and crawled through the snow to the ewes' side. The sheep was in active labor, her body convulsing with contractions. In this cold, the lambs wouldn't survive more than minutes after birth unless Margaret could get them all back to the barn. If you're rooting for Margaret and Bella right now, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, because what happens next will show you the true meaning of survival against impossible odds. Margaret's fingers worked frantically despite the numbness spreading through her hands. She stripped off her outer gloves, knowing she needed dexterity more than warmth for what came next. Bella's contractions were coming fast now, too fast. The first lamb was already crowning, its tiny nose visible in the harsh beam of Margaret's headlamp. She had assisted with dozens of births over the years, but never like this. Never in killing cold with wolves circling somewhere in the darkness. Never with her own life hanging by a thread alongside the animals she was trying to save. Her exposed fingers began to sting, then burn, then go terrifyingly numb as the cold bit into her flesh. The first lamb slid into her hands, tiny and perfect and utterly still. Margaret's heart sank. She rubbed the lamb vigorously with her scarf, trying to stimulate breathing, trying to generate any warmth in its small body. For several agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then a shudder ran through the tiny creature, and it gasped its first breath. Margaret nearly sobbed with relief. She shoved the lamb inside her parka, against her chest, zipping it up to trap whatever body heat she had left. The second lamb came moments later, this one already bleeding weakly. Margaret tucked it in beside its sibling, feeling their small bodies squirm against her skin. Twins. Bella had given her twins. But now came the impossible part. She was over a quarter-mile from the barn, carrying two newborn lambs, with an exhausted ewe who could barely stand. The temperature was still plummeting, and her fingers were now completely without feeling. She couldn't even tell if she was still wearing gloves or not. Frostbite was setting in. She could lose her fingers, maybe her hands, maybe her life if she didn't move fast. Margaret hooked her arms under Bella's front legs and heaved. The ewe was dead weight, weakened from labor and terror. Margaret pulled, dragged, stumbled backward through the snow. 5 feet, 10 feet. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. The lambs squirmed against her chest, their movements growing weaker as the cold penetrated even her layers of clothing. She fell twice, her exhausted legs giving out beneath her. Each time, she forced herself back up, grabbed Bella again, and continued dragging the sheep through the endless white. Her vision began to blur. Her thoughts became sluggish, confused. She knew these were signs of hypothermia, knew she was running out of time. The wolves howled in the distance. They were following, waiting for her to fail, waiting for an easy meal. Margaret's jaw clenched. She would die before she let that happen. Through the pre-dawn darkness, a light appeared. The barn. Her barn. It looked impossibly far away, a tiny beacon in an ocean of frozen death. But it was there. Margaret fixed her eyes on that light and pulled. One step. Another. Another. The lambs had stopped moving against her chest. Bella's breathing had become shallow and irregular. Margaret didn't remember the last 100 yards. Her body moved on autopilot, driven by something beyond conscious thought. Pure survival instinct mixed with stubborn determination. When her shoulder finally hit the barn door, she almost didn't recognize what it was. Her frozen fingers fumbled with the latch for what felt like hours before the door finally swung open. The barn's interior felt like a sauna compared to the outside, though it was barely above freezing. Margaret collapsed onto the hay-covered floor, still clutching Bella. She pulled the lambs from inside her parka with hands that looked like claws, white and waxy, the fingers bent at unnatural angles. She couldn't feel them at all anymore. The lambs weren't moving. Margaret's heart, which had somehow kept beating through everything, nearly stopped. She rubbed them frantically with dry hay, breathed warm air onto their tiny faces, massaged their chests. Come on, come on, come on. The smaller lamb twitched, then bleated. Then the second one jerked to life, crying out in protest at this harsh world it had been born into. Margaret laughed and cried simultaneously, tears freezing on her cheeks even in the relative warmth of the barn. She placed both lambs beside Bella, guiding them toward her teats. Within minutes, they were nursing, their small tails wagging with contentment. Margaret knew she needed to get inside the cabin, needed to treat her frostbitten hands before permanent damage set in. But for just a moment, she sat there in the hay, watching Bella clean her babies with gentle licks, watching new life persist despite a world that seemed determined to extinguish it. She thought of Daniel, of how proud he would have been. She had kept their promise. She had protected what they had built together. The homestead would survive another winter, and so would she. Using her elbows and forearms, Margaret pushed herself to her feet. She stumbled toward the cabin, leaving the barn door cracked so she could hear if anything went wrong. Inside, she plunged her hands into lukewarm water, gasping as sensation began to return in waves of excruciating pain. The fingers were white and swollen, several with black spots forming at the tips. She would lose parts of at least 3 fingers, she knew. But she was alive. They were all alive. As dawn finally broke over the Alaskan wilderness, painting the snow gold and pink, Margaret Hayes sat by her window with bandaged hands, watching smoke rise from her chimney into the frigid air. She had survived the night, and that was enough. 8 months later, the Alaskan summer painted the homestead in shades of green and gold that seemed impossible after the brutal winter. Wildflowers dotted the meadow where Margaret's expanded flock grazed peacefully in the midnight sun. The sheep had multiplied. Bella's twins, now healthy and strong, bounded through the grass alongside 10 other lambs born that spring. Margaret sat on the porch Daniel had built, her scarred hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. She had lost the tips of 2 fingers on her left hand and 1 on her right to frostbite. The doctors in Fairbanks had been amazed she hadn't lost more, amazed she had survived at all. The story of the widow who faced down wolves at 61 below had spread through Alaska like wildfire. A truck rumbled up the dirt road, her neighbor Tom bringing supplies and mail. He visited twice a week now ever since that night. The community had rallied around her in ways she never expected. They brought food, helped repair her barn, even built a new reinforced fence to keep the wolves out. She wasn't alone anymore, not really. Bella trotted over to the fence, her twins following close behind. Margaret walked down to greet them, running her damaged hands along their wool. The sheep nuzzled her palm, completely trusting, completely content. Those lambs had grown into the finest sheep in her flock, and Bella had given birth to another set of twins just last month. Margaret had received offers to sell the homestead. Good offers from people who thought she had proven her point and should finally rest. But this place wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about living the life she and Daniel had chosen, about honoring his memory by thriving, not just surviving. She had learned something that terrible February night. Strength wasn't about being fearless. It was about being terrified and pushing forward anyway. It was about protecting what mattered, even when everything inside you screamed to run. It was about deciding that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, though it wouldn't fully set for months, Margaret smiled. Her hands might be scarred, her body might carry the marks of that brutal night, but her spirit had never been stronger. Thank you so much for staying with Margaret's story until the end. If this journey moved you, please hit that like button, Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible true stories of survival and courage. What kind of story would you like to hear next? Drop your suggestions below. We read every single comment. Until next time, stay strong and keep fighting for what matters.